Hey guys, I prepared this video to show you how I made my own pivot bolts, rear pivot bolts for my Dengfu e10. You know, basically I was riding along on the bike, everything was going pretty good, and all of a sudden I noticed there was an unusual feeling in the rear end of the bike, and when I got off and checked, I noticed that one of the rear pivot bolts had fallen out and I'd lost it. So I knew it was a problem. I thought I'd taken actions necessary to prevent it happening. I'd Loctited the rear pivot bolts pretty good. I periodically checked them. I'd put markings on the pivot bolts so I could monitor them periodically throughout any ride that I was doing. But despite what I did, I still lost the pivot bolts. So after doing some research and trying to figure out what I was going to do to replace the rear pivot bolt that I lost, I decided it would be best to build my own pivot bolts and replace both rear pivot bolts on my bike. So I prepared this video to explain not only how I built the rear pivot bolts, but how I came to the conclusion that that was the best option. I also am going to show you what the pivot bolts look like. I want to show you how they work. I want to explain why I think they are the best option to build your own rear pivot bolts. And I want to explain why the pivot bolts I built are superior to the original equipment pivot bolts. So with that, let's get to it. Okay guys, this is going to be a video showing my Dengfu e10 rear pivot bolts. I'm going to talk about the issues and solutions and show the DIY solution I ultimately decided to go with here. First of all, just to ground us all, here's a picture of an OEM pivot bolt installed on a trailing arm. You can see the 8 millimeters or an 8 Newton meter torque reading on it, and you can see the T30 Torx head here, and you can see where it's just sitting in the rear trailing arm. This is a picture of the trailing arm with the pivot bolt missing. This is something you don't want to see if you're out on the trail riding your bike. And this is just another picture showing when the pivot bolt's out, how I could stick my finger in there so you can see the pivot bolt is completely missing here. Just to sort of ground us all here, this is an OEM pivot bolt and nut assembled. That's what it looks like. This is the OEM pivot bolt showing just the bolt itself and the nut. To give you some details here, this is the OEM rear pivot nut and bolt. In this picture, just to sort of ground you, this is the front of the bike. And this is the actual bolt. This is the nut. Looking at the nut first, it's 22 millimeters. It's beveled on two sides for 19 millimeters and a 6 millimeter thickness. The actual bolt, this on the drive side, this section would be sticking out. That's where you see the T30 Trox here. That flange is 21 millimeters. It's about 3 millimeters thick. The thread is 4.5 millimeters. The bolt is 12 millimeters wide. It goes in about 34 millimeters there. So that is the OEM nut and bolt. Now, on the actual OEM bolt, I think there are some shortcomings to this. First of all, the thread contact between the nut and the bolt is relatively small. There's only 4.5 millimeters of thread contact, not much. Also, when the nut falls off, when it unscrews, the nut falls off immediately, and then very shortly thereafter, the bolt will work itself out and it will fall off. So you can lose both of them, which is what happened to me. Also, another shortcoming is to tighten this thing, you need a Torx T30. T30 is not a normal size. Most multi-tools have a T25. Very few have a T30. So unless you're prepared, it's hard to tighten it on the trail, even if you know that it's loose. when I lost my bolt, I decided I had three options. One, I could just go in and buy another OEM part and replace it. Second, I could buy an OEM part and I could somehow modify the OEM part so that it would be more likely to stay on the bike. Third, I could make or machine a DIY replacement. Now, in looking at the replacing the OEM, that was easy and straightforward. You can find OEM replacements. You may have a little trouble making sure that the OEM replacement actually will fit the E10, but you can find replacements. However, if you put an OEM on, most likely it's going to fall out again if you just do the same thing you did when you originally assembled the bike. And basically, if you just put on the OEM, I didn't feel like I'd be learning from the experience, and I would just be redoing all the original shortcomings or buying into them again. But and I would just have a ticking time bomb, if you will. It's just a matter of time before that OEM is going to fall out if you just install it the same way, in my opinion. So the second option would be, buy the OEM and modify it. You'd get the same benefits as number one, but you could probably address some of the issues in number one. So for example, you could take the retaining bolt, drill it, tap it, and add a bolt through it, either all the way through it or partially through it, that would make sure that if it comes unscrewed, it can't fall off until the retaining bolt unscrews. So that would help. Another example, someone on Facebook user group mentioned that they wrapped their pivot in cellophane so that upon unscrewing, it would likely not separate from the bike. I thought that was a pretty novel solution and actually considered that. But you'd still have the issue of losing the nut and bolt depending on how good the modification is that you make. And number four, if you do the second option, you'll still have the T30 Torx issue. Now, if you go in and make your own, it's going to be much more labor intensive. You got to get the material. You need to have a lathe and a milling machine, which most people don't have. You got to design and manufacture the replacement, so that's going to require a little ingenuity and imagination. And you need to make sure that there's enough space. You need to make sure there's enough space for the bolt heads and the lock nut. So I decided to go with option number three. The reasons are, I like riding this bike. I've really enjoyed the Dengfu e10 for a lot of reasons, but I really like it. And I want it to be as reliable as possible. I don't want to always be worrying about the darn, rear pivot bolts. And second, even though I'm not a very experienced machinist, I felt like that making the part was relatively easy and straightforward. And after measuring or doing a bunch of measurements, I decided that I could come up with a design that would give me enough clearance. So I decided to make my own. So first of all, the material. The material was easy to get. I bought a 1-inch thick aluminum rod. This is a picture of it here. On Amazon for about $10. The rod's 13 inches. 13 inches is more than enough to make 2 pivot bolts. So no problem getting the material. This is my little machine shop, metal lathe. Most of the work was done here, just turning down that 1-inch aluminum rod. And like I said, most people don't have one of these, but you clearly got to have one of these to make the replacement part that I made. The other thing is a milling machine. I did use mine, but I only used it to mill off the rounded part of the pivot to fit in the flat area on the trailing arm. You could easily have just, sanded that down, but I did use the milling machine. The milling machine's not necessary in this particular application, but anyway, I did use it here. Another important thing that you need is a tap and die, and this is an Irwin Matric tap and die set. You need this to create some 6mm by 1 threads inside the screw, and this is it's set up to make that tap. Now here is the DIY bolt and nut. And similar to the earlier OEM, this is the front of the bike, and here's the right side of the bike. And I've shown a disassembled bolt, how it would go onto the bike. And on the left side, the disc side, I've shown the pivot assembly all together, all assembled. So this would be the nut. So, you know, this is the old nut, but on this, the nut would actually have the shaft attached to it, and you're going to screw this bolt into that shaft. When you screw the bolt into that shaft, it will have the lock washer and washer, and that will attach it, and the bolt, it won't pull out because the washer will be holding it, the nut will be holding it in, and this side of the nut will be holding it in. So this would be a 42 millimeter 6x1 bolt. It'll go into a lock washer, into a 2 millimeter thick washer that will screw all the way through this. And then there will be a little protrusion, and on the protrusion, you'll put in a lock nut. Now, I believe that this will address the OEM issues. First of all, the 4.5 millimeter of thread has been replaced with over 35 millimeters of thread contact between the nut and bolt. That's much better. Also, in the OEM, the nut and bolt will fall off when they come unscrewed, but I've tried to address this 4 ways. First of all, the bolt has a long attachment to the nut, so most likely you'll see it when it starts to unscrew, so you can catch it before it falls out. Second, the bolt will be secured by a lock washer. Third, once the bolt is torqued on, a lock nut will be screwed onto the protruding part of the bolt. And, you know, that when you screw the lock nut on, that should independently hold it in so that if it starts to unscrew, it's also got to unscrew that lock nut, which is highly unlikely. And similar to the OEM, you can Loctite the threads, but because there's much longer contact between the threads, the Loctite has a much better attachment and should work better in this application. And the third thing that's been addressed in my design, I'm no longer using a T30 Torx head. That's been replaced by a 4 millimeter head, which is 4 millimeter is very common, should be on any multi-tool. I'm going to show how I install the DIY pivot bolt here. What I do is, as you can see, the pivot bolt has flat spots on it that will line up with flat spots that are in here. This wooden piece, you know, helps to guide the pivot bolt in. So basically, I'm coming in and mashing it in like that. Once I get the bolt mashed in, then what I do is I have the screw, and on the screw, I'm going to go, this is the 6 millimeter screw. I'm putting on the lock washer, then the washer that will bump up against the pivot. And now I come in over here and screw this in into the pivot right here. And it screws, you know, a good ways in there because I want to have a lot of thread contact so that when I put Loctite on it, I'll have a lot of contact, and if it were to start coming out, it would be very noticeable. Once I have it screwed in, I will then come in. I'm not going to show it on here, but I would torque it to 8 Newton meters, and then I'll take the lock washer, or the lock nut. I'm sorry, not the lock washer, the lock nut. And as you can see here, there's bolt protruding out. I will put this lock nut on here, and then I will tighten that down. And there, with the tightened nut, you know, it's going to be, even if it starts to come loose, it's going to have to loosen up that that lock nut, and that'll be very hard to do. So that's how I install the DIY pivot bolts. This is a picture showing the bolt screwing into the shaft that's attached to the washer. And as you can see, there's over 35 millimeter of thread contact between the nut and bolt. Also note the amount of protrusion there. So it would have to protrude all this way out before it can fall out. And most likely you would see that before you know, it falls out. And note here, you can see the lock washer there and the regular washer there, just to give you a benefit of where they are. Once you screw that bolt all the way in, you'll have a protrusion. And this is a picture inside the wheel well. And this picture shows the protrusion of that 6 millimeter bolt. And this is where the lock nut will be attached. And once again, this is inside the wheel well, and it's before attachment of the lock nut. Here is the lock nut attached. So this is inside the wheel well. And as you can see, the lock nut has been attached. And on this, it's attached so that there's, you know, I was worried a little bit about the clearance here because the disc here is here, but there was plenty of room for the disc. And on the drive side, there seemed to be, or is, enough clearance for the cassette, the chain, and the derailleur. So there were no issues there. This picture just shows that all you need to do to tighten it is a 4 millimeter hex head to screw and unscrew the bolt. Once again, much more likely to have one of those. This shows that the attachment here is protruding out more than the OEM, but this is a button head, and the button head, you know, is very rounded. So even though it protrudes out, it's not, you know, it's not much less likely to get caught on anything. From riding the bike, I have no issues with interference with the derailleur. No interference with the pedal path of pedaling the bike. And on the other side of the bike, there was no real issue with the rear axle bolt. You know, all things that I was originally a little bit concerned about, but they're not issues in my experience. This is just a picture showing a last look of this. This is the pivot bolt installed on the bike. This is where the hole was in some of the earlier pictures. And now I'm much more confident that the bolt will not come unscrewed and detached from the bike before I can detect the impending problem. So, you know, if it starts to screw out, I mean, I should be able to see it well before it comes all the way out. So that's my DIY rear pivot bolt and how it works on my Dengfu bike. I hope I've given you guys something to think about, and I'll see you at the top.